probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about marching band unless it's band season and you're in one. Marching bands, however, are integral on game day in America. High school bands have their own competition culture, and there's a major league of marching bands. You probably have your own thoughts and feelings about bands and the people in them, but despite your own thoughts and feelings, bands are important to American culture, if just in the collegiate aspect. I've been in marching band a while, 5 years after this past season's conclusion, which I think makes me a credible source to talk about band as an experience from an insider's perspective. However, I think the 3-ish weeks of research I've done also makes me a source on the history of how marching bands have developed throughout American history, and how their past influences how they operate today. This month's video covers a little bit of all that, focused on the development of drum corps, college, and high school bands throughout their history and how it ties to the history of our great nation and the many that came before it. If you want to see last month's video, it'll pop up as a little eye icon in the top right corner right about now. I hope you enjoy. Marching band has been linked to some of the earliest works humanity has ever written. The oldest text remaining from the Indian subcontinent, the Rig Veda, codified around 1500 to 1000 BCE, brings mention of a war drum. Drive hither those, and these again bring hither. The war drum speaks aloud as battle's signal. Though it may seem unlikely, the concept of a marching band developed from this very tradition, which propagated across so many different cultures. An article from the University of Minnesota's Media History Project highlights the prevalence of those drums, used in cultures such as in Czechia in 6000 BCE, Egypt in 4000, Sumeria in 3000, and a relief image was found in India dating back to around 2000 BCE. These drums were predominantly used to spread messages across battlefields in times of war. Regular, more standard means of communication, like shouting, were inaudible over the clashing of equipment, swords striking shields, yelling, screams of pain, arrows firing, shields breaking, neighing. This meant that drummers throughout history have been an integral part in military activities since the beginning of mass human conflict. Later, during the 14th century, the modern snare drum was invented to abolish the tone of the drum and create a sharper and more distinguishable sound, which was introduced to medieval Europe as the tabor. You can see this in this image, a depiction of the tabor, meant to be played with a single hand. The most notable part of this image is the single line that stretches across the face of the drum to limit resonance and create a sharper sound. Also of note is the woodwind instrument that is being played simultaneously, which was also used in military signals. This specific development of wind instruments is not related directly to the use of wind instruments in the current band setting, however. This snare drum was imported to America, like most other things, by the British in their colonialization efforts. The snare was first recorded in use in Jamestown, the first permanent settlement in America. Its use was to convey military orders and to draw in their enemies, the Powhatan people, during a battle in 1610. These colonists continued their use of the snare drum throughout colonial times. It made it all the way to the Revolutionary War, with some of George Washington's own units utilizing the snare drum. The big leap in usage in American culture came with the Civil War, when more drummers were enlisted than ever before in the United States. This created a new culture and prominence for the snare drum, where new regiments on both sides needed their own drummers for communication in camp and in battles. The new prominence of drummers in all aspects of life and the formation of military bands to accompany them created a new culture separate from more classical musical traditions. Separately, brass instruments gained a footing in the military tradition in Europe before being imported to America. The first ancestor to the bugle created is thought to be from just after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which was fashioned out of an ox horn. This seems like ancient history, and it is, but the war drum was its predecessor by a large margin. Thus, the first brass instruments were likely made out of land animals' horns. Might seem a little odd to call an ivory horn a brass instrument, but a brass instrument simply uses buzzing lips and a horn to amplify sound. The first standard set of calls developed for the bugle that began American bugle tradition came from the British in around 1778. This helped cement the bugle as a permanent signaling instrument in American militaries and militias. One of the first known uses of the bugle in North America was in the American Revolution at the Battle of Harlem Heights in September of 1776. The bugle thus began its history in military tradition and continued to become more standardized. You're probably familiar with many American bugle calls, which have become ingrained in certain experiences. The call to the post is an iconic bugle line you might be familiar with. You probably know it from horse races, being the call from a trumpeter or bugler right before the race starts. It first started in military tradition, being the call 10 minutes before the wake-up call on base, intended to be a courtesy call. When used in the military, it's called first call. Another one that you're probably familiar with as an American is taps, which signals the end of the day, or more commonly nowadays, is played at the conclusion of a military funeral. North American band culture truly started development in the Civil War. Both of these methods were employed in tandem more than ever seen before, and regiments on both sides of the conflict were employing bands for signaling, entertainment, and morale improvement. As the conflict was running and manpower began to run low, as it's still the deadliest conflict in American history, they began to enlist anybody as musicians and war signalers, even those that couldn't read music or play anything prior. This meant that more and more people got exposure, although the music did begin to suffer from time to time, with some stories mentioning that one of the bands for a regiment was so awful that the soldiers had to point their weapons at the band to get the music to cease. While there was limited band activity beforehand, such as the Marine Band established in 1798, it really began to spread following the Civil War as the number of instrumentalists increased. Notre Dame had its band before the Civil War, but they first played at a football game after the war's conclusion. The Band of the Fighting Irish have attended every Notre Dame home game since 1887. This is where the two main traditions of marching band began to diverge. Drum corps as an activity stems directly from the military traditions. Veterans from the First World War and before wanted to continue playing their instruments in a similar band setting as before, and so they established groups that became the Civilian Drum and Bugle Corps. These groups originally used strict rules on which instruments could participate, limited only to bugles in G. This meant that the trumpets they used had no vowels, instead using only the natural harmonic notes of the bugle tuned in G. This paired with the drums to form the most basic version of a drum corps. The music created with only G bugles was limited as the full range of notes was not yet available. There was also a requirement for the colors to be presented, the flags, with a patriotic section of the performance, and all performances were required to start in the left end zone and end in the right end zone. Many players were unhappy with these rules created by the American Legion and other such governing bodies for drum corps, and pushed to change the rules. In 1972, these groups broke away and formed a group created by the musicians themselves, Drum Corps International, which is still the main drum corps association today. The founding members consisted of 13 drum corps from 3 different associations that combined. The first ever DCI championship was won at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and the champion was the Anaheim Kingsmen. In the late 1970s, DCI began to allow 2 valve horns to reach more notes that were not previously available. 3 valves became allowed in 1990. Later, after 1999, DCI allowed any key of horn used due to the increasing cost of the exclusive G bugle. This made the horns used in DCI much more standard for the rest of the musical instruments, as the trumpet used most commonly nowadays is pitched in B flat. Many of the 13 original corps began to struggle financially, and eventually 6 of them would fold, leaving the Blue Stars, the Cavaliers, the Madison Scouts, the Santa Clara Vanguard, Troopers, Boston Crusaders, and Cadets as the remaining founding members in 2024. Several of these corps have had to take years off to reorganize and rework financials, most notably and recently the Santa Clara Vanguard in this past 2023 season. There are some other drum corps bodies, notably DCA or Drum Corps Associates, but they are not the main drum corps governance in America and are thus not in the scope of this video. Drum corps started out rigid. It was all about company fronts, long lines, and stationary tempos when it emerged in the 70s. Take a look at this Santa Clara Vanguard show from 1977. You can hear the limited range of notes from their bugles with few vowels, and you can also see how rigid and slow the movement of the players is. This was the third place show in 1977, so it's not just a sample of a show that's bad. This was pretty good for the time. As 1980 began, it brought some changes. In this sample from 1980 Blue Devils' first place show, you can see just how much the horn line has developed to create a much more warm, fulfilling sound. Drum corps continued to get more dynamic and less rigid as the activity aged throughout the 80s, and the design became less of an afterthought to the sound of the horn line. 1988 Suncoast Sound had a unique use of music in its horn line. It was more punchy and harsh, unlike the more grand sound that had been pervasive in drum corps for a long time, which can be heard here. In 1992, the Cavaliers focused on something no one had before, the auxiliaries. The percussion and color guard were a major point of focus for this specific group, and while they were not as good in the traditional categories and commonly said to be worse marchers, they won off their battery and color guard. And to conclude the 90s, the Blue Devils marched the last ever G bugle horn line in 1999. In 2002, the Cavaliers performed a show called Frameworks, which was the consensus #1 show. It combined everything together spectacularly. Very complex musical show combined with a more dynamic drill that had been evolving. It was a significant building block in DCI show design moving into the 21st century. 2008, Phantom Regiment performed their legendary show Spartacus, telling the story of a Roman revolution. It started to normalize storytelling as a show progresses. In the end of the show, the drum major is killed dramatically by a performer in one of the coolest moments in DCI history, as the new drum major from the peasants, arisen from the lowest part of the Roman Empire, draws his baton in classic Phantom Regiment style. In 2014, the Bluecoats performed my favorite drum corps show, and a show that began to cement the use of electronics in the front ensemble as an integral part of shows going forward with this legendary moment in Tilt. Since then, the Blue Devils have kept winning and being the corps to beat on finals night, having won the last 3 DCI championships in a row and 6 of the last 8. Concord, California is the place to be if you want to end your season with a ring. High school marching bands mostly follow the drum corps style of marching. When teaching fundamentals to a bunch of freshmen, especially the type that band kids are, it's most simple to keep it in the same context and thus one show for the whole band season. High schools also often participate in a competition circuit, and thus they use one show to continue towards perfection and a higher score. This often comes at the cost of interest during football games, as an audience doesn't really want to pay attention to 6 or so of the same show as it progresses through a season. The dream is to win state for most bands, and many bands want to make it to nationals at Bands of America. Our band won one of the circuits in my state my senior year, known as CSBC, so we have a claim that we won state, which is kind of fun. College marching bands began in the modern sense with the Band of the Fighting Irish, and started in the same tradition as drum corps. The difference, however, is the quick departure of college bands from this older military tradition, adapting more readily to the traditions and atmosphere of the community that they represent, and the game day of their beloved football team. The band has integral parts in the traditions of game day across the nation, from the Script, Ohio, the Block M Field March at Michigan, the 4-Way Cross March at A&M, Simple Gifts at West Virginia, or the Trojan Marching Band joining a horse for pregame. Once college bands departed initially, they all began to create their own forms and styles of marching that best suits their needs. However, they began from military tradition, and from former military show bands, and thus they have some commonalities. Most college bands have different marching styles, and there are 3 main styles of marching. Easiest, most common one is the glide step or the roll step. These are 2 slightly different forms of low marching, where the feet leave the ground as much as a normal walking step, maybe a little bit less. It's commonly used while walking and playing, as it makes it easier to remain stable enough to push large amounts of air through a horn to play loud. There's high step, which is what we call it in the Marching Jayhawks. It has some other names too. It means that the knee comes up much farther than in normal walking, but not quite to a right angle. This is much more flashy and showy. It creates a nice visual appeal when in sync. The hardest to get right, but the most visually appealing, is the chair step technique, where the knee comes to a 90-degree angle and the ankle kicks out. This is hard to perform exactly right. It looks really sloppy if done poorly, and many bands have started to phase this out because of that. It's impossible to cover all marching band traditions in college because they're all different, but there's a basic formula for the traditional college band performance on game day. Bands will usually have some sort of festivity outside the stadium a couple hours before kickoff. The KU Marching Jayhawks march from the Student Union down to the hill overlooking the stadium, play a few tunes, and then walk into the stadium after the concert. At Notre Dame, there's a procession to the stadium playing their victory march, and Ohio State marches in to a drum cadence. This presents opportunities to start hearing the sounds of game day and feel the energy that is normally in the stadium to get the spectators in the game day mindset. After, the band usually appears in the concourses or the tunnels to await an entrance. The band usually begins a unique pregame routine to their school, most often starting with a loud and energetic entrance while lining up and running onto the field. Pregames vary from school to school, but the school's fight song is always included, commonly among some audience participation and the alma mater. After pregame, the band proceeds to the stands to play fight songs, touchdown songs after scores, and at halftime performs a show. A significant number of college bands have a different show every single football game, and they're usually based around some form of pop culture. If you have a friend in a different college band, it's common to ask, "What's your show this week?" And for them to respond with Taylor Swift or Van Halen or Mamma Mia, which are all shows that I've played in with the Marching Jayhawks. After this is over, they return to the stands for more pep tunes, and then game day often concludes with a fight song and some other traditions. We play Home on the Range. University of Wisconsin has a fifth quarter where they play some of their traditional songs. Pep bands, extension of the marching band, usually play at a significant number of other sports too. Most common are basketball, volleyball, or hockey. They also bring the school atmosphere to these events as well, and the band can also represent outside of sports, like at parades for the schools, salutes to service, and as general representatives of the university. Marching band shares many aspects of the performing and visual arts with the other performing and visual arts, but it has a unique blend of physicality and musical performance. This makes it a very interesting and complex form of expression that's lost on a lot of people outside the activity. Band brings a very unique and loving culture between groups. For high school band shows and in drum corps, you'll find rivals wishing each other good luck and complimenting their show, saying only positive things to build each other up. In college, even the most bitter of rivals have fun beating opposing bands, despite the results that the football teams might bring. This creates a culture where everyone feels welcome and brings in a new family. Some of my best friends have been made in marching band and will continue to be made as I finish up my marching band career with the Marching Jayhawks. One of the things that makes it feel as nice as it does is the limited time we have with the activity. Most leaving once their senior year concludes or when they age out of their drum corps. Thanks for watching my video all the way through if you made it this far. And if you have a chance to go see a local band competition or drum corps show, take it. You'll be surprised how good drum corps can sound, and you'll be supporting someone's dream, as many people can't afford to be in a drum corps. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for watching.